Well, good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and good morning if you're way out west. My name's Aaron Lacey, and you're listening to the Higher Education Regulatory Outlook for 2026, which has become sort of an annual webinar event for us here at Thompson Coburn. This is part of our higher education webinar series. In case you are a newcomer, Thompson Coburn is a law firm. We have offices around the country, these days about 500 attorneys. And we have a higher education practice, which means we have a group of lawyers who spend all or most of their time serving institutions of higher education. Mentioned earlier, my name's Aaron Lacey. I'm one of the co-chairs of the higher education practice, and my real focus tends to be these days federal higher education policy and regulation. And I tend to spend a lot of time dedicated to that, as some of you I know are aware. And in addition, spend a fair amount of time helping folks with, I'll say, sort of complex governance and substantive change type matters, including mergers and acquisitions. While folks are still coming on, here's some of our housekeeping for the day. First of all, there's a Q&A widget, hopefully somewhere around your screen that you see. And during the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in, and I will try to get to some of them at the end. There's also a resource widget, and I just want to highlight, you should have slides to the presentation there. If for some reason they're not there or you can't find them, just let us know, shoot me an email, and we will certainly get you a copy. I want you to have a copy. The help widget on your screen has assistance with various technical types of issues. So if you're experiencing some kind of technical concern, you might check there. Also, like most of our webinars, today's webinar is approved for continuing legal education credit. I need to include a line item for CLE here. Today's presentation specifically is accredited in California, Illinois, and Texas for 1.5 hours of general credit, in Missouri for 1.8 hours of general credit, and in New York for 1.5 hours of professional practice credit for experienced and transitional attorneys. We award CLE based on attendance for the entire program. So during the presentation, there will be some secret words that come up. If you're here for CLE, please make sure to select the correct secret word and stick around for the duration of the program so we can award you your continuing legal education credit. And finally, there is a post-webinar survey. I'm personally always so grateful for the folks who take the time to fill that out. As I always say, and it is true, we read those surveys every single time, and we take the recommendations to heart in order to try to make each presentation better than the one before. Just a couple other quick notes. Our presentation preamble. First of all, I'm talking a lot about federal policy, regulation, outlook for the year. As you would imagine, things are changing and will change in the coming weeks and months. If you happen to be watching a recording of this on YouTube at some point after today, please just keep in mind that laws and policies and regulations and all those kinds of things do change. There are live links throughout this presentation. That's why I want to make sure you get that PDF from the resources tab, because I have linked to lots of additional resources for you if you are the kind of person who is really interested in digging a little deeper. You can also find links not only to our YouTube presentations and trainings, but a lot of other materials on our resources page, which we call Regulation. And if you scan that QR code, it will take you there as well. And all that stuff's free, and included there is our marvelous litigation summary update that our litigation team puts together on a monthly basis, and it covers lots and lots of the higher ed litigation that's out there right now and sort of gives you a status update on where all that stands. Here's our syllabus. I won't tell you how many slides I have because I don't want you to start sweating, but it's a lot. Here are the things we're going to try to cover: state of ed, policy and priorities, very briefly, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, 2026 negotiated rulemaking. I'll do an overview, and then I'm going to start marching through all the different negotiated rulemaking committees. We'll do just a second on PSLF, then we'll do RISE, AHEAD, AIM, our brand new entry as of today, the Kitchen Sink Committee, which is my name, not theirs, and then we'll go beyond negotiated rulemaking. I almost put Bed Bath and Beyond negotiated rulemaking, but my IP attorneys told me that that would be a problem. The state of ed. So, we're going to talk a lot today about the rulemaking activity and policy activity that's going on, what we think that's going to happen in 2026. But when you're talking about the regulatory outlook for the year, one of the things you have to talk about that is absolutely going to impact institutions is the state of the department itself, meaning in terms of its staffing and its own administrative capability. As I'm sure everyone in this line knows, or hopefully knows, in March of last year, the department initiated a RIF, or reduction in force, and cut about half their staff, right? There was litigation that immediately followed that. I've referenced a couple of the lawsuits. If you want more detail about that, you can go to our litigation summary that is on the previously mentioned resources page. Very shortly after the RIF was initiated, the president issued an executive order about the department. And among other things, the heart of that executive order was a directive to the Secretary of Education to diminish the department to the maximum extent appropriate and permitted under the law. And that executive order is still in effect. Now, there's been litigation there as well, but as of right now, it is not enjoined, which means that this department the agency itself is under standing order to diminish itself to the maximum extent permitted under the law. Following the RIF and the president's directive, the department started a lot of realignment. One of the areas or units within the department that was most significantly affected was federal student aid. And by that, I mean all those case team individuals who have been assisting you institutions for years to answer frontline questions, whether they deal with eligibility or certification or technical concerns, to process recertifications or initial certifications, new applications for programs or additional locations, big substantive changes like changes in ownership or mergers. Your case teams handled all of that. And you can see this was an ed organizational chart that was leaked out of the department very shortly after the RIF. It's dated March 20, and it actually has all of the case teams that were in place prior to March 20. And you can literally see crossed out all the people who were at those different case teams. I mean, the salient point here is across the entire United States, all of these case teams were essentially wiped out except for Chicago, Denver, and Philly. There was another chart that came out right after the RIF. Some of you may have seen this before in my presentations, that not only talks about the total number, but sort of shows you the divisions within the department that took the biggest hit. Now, we just talked about, we know federal student aid was one of those. It's the biggest division within the department in terms of like employees, but it's still 326 is a big number. But what this chart also gives you a sense of is what other divisions took significant hits. And right behind federal student aid was the Office of Civil Rights. And then you had the Institute of Educational Sciences in at number 3, which does a lot of research and data management for the U.S. Department of Education. So where are we now? What is 2026 going to look like for you all as you're planning potentially to undertake some types of substantive changes or expansions or initiatives, et cetera, that are going to involve interacting with the department? First of all, the department continues to operate under extreme resource constraints. Like a host of law firms in the United States, our firm works with the department on an almost daily basis. We know a lot of the folks over there. It is clear to us that career staff and appointees alike, and I want to make this point because it's meaningful, have really made a point of being receptive, at least in our experience, to outreach from institutions. And in a tonally, that was a little bit of a change, I'll say, from the prior administration. But the loss of numbers in terms of employees and institutional knowledge, meaning, all that sort of legacy information that went with those employees who were RIF'd, has dramatically impacted the agency's ability to not only process new initiatives, but clear legacy matters. There are huge backlogs of applications for, new locations and programs and changes in ownership that we know have been sitting out there for 2 or 3 years. And there's this, extremely reduced group of people who are now trying to manage all of that. I mentioned earlier, there was all this litigation challenging both the RIF and the executive order. It continues to percolate, but with diminished relevance, I would say, because at this point, many of those individuals who were part of that RIF a year later or nearly a year later have moved on, we believe, or may not just be available to come back or may not want to come back. Also, no injunctions are in place as these cases proceed on the merits. So in other words, as these cases move forward, there's nothing stopping the department from, in other words, continuing with its RIF and diminishing strategy. The department voluntarily informed certain OCR employees in December 2025 that they were expected to return to work while some of these RIF cases were litigated. Really, what we think this is about is the department's recognition that it's got a backlog right now and it needs to bring in some people to help get through the backlog. One of those areas where they have a big backlog is with outstanding civil rights complaints to the department. We also have heard through the grapevine that the department is hiring staff. I don't know that that's rehiring. Could be new individuals to come in to reduce backlogs in specific areas. So in other words, rather than hiring someone to just come in and sort of shore up one of the remaining case teams, they would hire maybe 1 or 2 people to come in specifically to process program approvals or specifically to process additional location approvals to try to work through these big backlogs. So you got someone who's just doing the same thing over and over and over in high volume. Technical and system issues continue to impede approvals. We have had repeated situations where folks at the department have been receptive. They've understood the application. The application potentially has even been approved in the e-app, but that's not flowing through satisfactorily to other systems in the federal government. So in other words, all those systems aren't talking as they need to, such that funds can actually start to flow or codes can be processed and pushed through. So there's still just a lot of system dysfunction. Even where staff is hearing you and trying to push things through, you then get into these technological issues. Also, easy audit in our experience continues to be a real challenge. If you are filing audits and everything very much in the normal course, you may not be dealing with this. But if you have anything that's sort of idiosyncratic, if you went through a substantive change or merged with another institution, many of those types of things to be resolved in easy audit, in our experience, is requiring manual intervention by staff. And the individuals at the department who are managing financial issues, meaning issues related to financials and annual submissions and other things through easy audit, that group has grown extremely small, is our experience. So it's getting very hard to get some of these things managed. We've seen some contractors to the department who've reached out to try to help fix some of these issues who aren't full-time employees of the department. So there's just still a lot going on. The department does seem to be making some efforts to increase efficiencies, right? So earlier last year in 2025 in May, they had the new policy around if you're trying to change your creditors. Something that really jumped out at me is the last bullet on this screen. According to this new approach, the department says if it doesn't make a determination on your application to change creditors, right, the reasonable cause determination within 30 days, the request will be deemed approved by default, which is fascinating to me. I haven't seen this come up anywhere else yet on my radar, at least not with any sort of significant or substantive application concepts. But the point is, here's the department saying, you know what, if we can't get to it within a certain amount of time, it's just going to be approved by default. That is certainly an approach that can help reduce backlog around certain processes. We know the department is trying to fix the e-app. They appreciate that there are challenges there. We're getting a lot of feedback on that front. They have also tried to reduce the number of fields and the amount of information that's being requested. As many of you know, at the same time that the e-app migrated over to Partner Connect, it was also dramatically expanded and started requesting lots and lots and lots of additional information for institutions, like emails for board members and information about CFO family members and COO family members and their ownership interests potentially, or involvement on boards, et cetera. Really nuanced stuff. This administration has tried to pare a little of that back, which will help them process things more efficiently and help schools get through processes more efficiently. Another example that we've seen repeatedly and that came up in the AHEAD rulemaking, I think most people on the line know, but I was one of the primary negotiators during the AHEAD rulemaking that just finished. We had a week in December and a week in January. And one of the things the department communicated to us, and we know communicated to other negotiators during other rulemakings, is that they are really prioritizing operational efficiency when they are thinking about, you know, how much information they want to ask for and the types of processes they want to put in place. This was a big reason that the department in the AHEAD rulemaking wanted to apply one test because, among other things, it's just easier to administer. Now, I say here in the last bullet, and I think it's true, this desire for operational efficiency, we believe, will still take a backseat to priorities around policy. So, you know, to the extent that the department wants additional data around your admissions and things along those lines, you know, even though that's more work for them to do, they're still going to put that in place because it's a policy priority. But where they can, we think the department is trying to become as efficient as possible. Some of you have seen this graphic before. I've used to sort of conceptualize how I think about the department's efficiency. The note here, or the idea here, is you sort of got two vectors. One is the size of the department's workforce, and the other is the scope of responsibility and complexity of their processes. And the notion is when those things are equally matched, you have this sort of point of efficiency, right? And my view was, under the prior administration, we still had a lot of hands on deck, but processes had become increasingly complex. And the consequence was we ended up out here at number one. And I've said before publicly, my view is after the RIF occurred last March, we dropped down to number two. Because at that point, you know, we still had all these complex processes that have been put in place by the prior administration. And now we had half the staff to try to carry them out. I think the department is trying to make its way back to the point of efficiency by reducing the complexity of its processes. And I think it is very slowly heading in that direction. So I've used the old, like when you're in the in the mall and there's a big map of the "we are here." I think "we are here" is where that square is, somewhere between point 3 and 2. Still a ways to go, I fear, to get to number 4. By the way, if you've not seen this yet in one of my presentations, please check it out and take it home with you. If you're at a school, this is the realigned sort of responsibilities at FSA. And to our understanding, this is still very much the case. So this is post-RIF, after the department sort of got reorganized, who the primary points of contact were for various things. You got Jeremy Early, who's the acting branch chief, over sort of all the case teams. Tammy Sawyer and Sherry Bell are sort of the two folks under Jeremy. And you can see in that area of responsibility, if you were a school that was in San Francisco or Dallas, Kansas City, everything got moved over to Tammy. If you were in Philly, Atlanta regions, New York, Boston, everything is now under Sherry. And then you've got some folks who've been assigned responsibility for very specific types of functions at the department. We do a lot of work with Kelly Goers because we work on a number of mergers, affiliations, and changes in ownership. So hopefully if you're trying to reach somebody at the department and the career staff, one of the case teams, and the folks you used to work with aren't there anymore and you've been struggling, please try some of the folks who are here. They should be able to help you. Okay. That's the state of the department. Now let's move into the policy stuff. First of all, here are the appointees at the department who are really pushing forward higher education policy these days. You may have some familiarity with these folks. You can look them up on the department's website. Nicholas Kent, of course, is the senior most person, is the undersecretary. And you've got Ashley Wright, James Bergeron, Jeff Andrade, and Jason Delisle, all who are supporting him and the department as it tries to move forward with rulemakings and other initiatives. I will highlight Jason Delisle was over at the American Enterprise Institute, Urban Institute. Jason's an economist, and it's just an interesting addition to me. And it sort of highlights the extent to which the role of economists and folks who are good at understanding and thinking about data have become central to some of the policy initiatives at the department. And again, we saw that very much during the second week of the head committee's meetings when we talked about accountability. The department had a great deal of data that was available. It had been crunched. We heard presentations from Jason Delisle, and Cody also on his team got a lot of data to review, including the PPD 26 data set. And the department is now being very thoughtful about including a seat at the table during negotiated rulemakings. The constituency is taxpayers, but the individuals who fill those seats tend to be folks like Jason, who have backgrounds working in think tanks and really understanding and working with data. So just when we talk about the forming of policy, one of the things that I think has really emerged in the last 4 or 5 years, and we're seeing prominently in this administration, is the role of think tanks and in particular sort of economists in helping shape policy in higher education. Here are your higher ed policy drivers. And all of this is being sort of pushed in and directing and informing negotiated rulemaking and other rulemaking efforts. And I, in my mind, sort of think of these drivers as falling into 3 big buckets. The first is, of course, Congress. And it's worth noting, this is the first time in 18 years that we've had Congress really in the mix, pushing departmental regulatory agenda, because it's been 17, 18 years since 2008 when the Higher Education Act was last reauthorized. So last year when the One Big Beautiful Bill Act came to be, that sort of statutory commentary, the new instructions to the department and the around higher education policy are really informing the department now and its rulemaking activities. So the policy drivers, the bullets that you see in this chart underneath Congress, these are the things that were in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, right? So loan program terminations, limitations, and proration, simplified loan repayment plans, default rehabilitation, Pell cost of attendance limit, and then workforce Pell grants, accountability, bar defense, closed school loan discharge, right? So all of those things were part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OB3, and they're all driving some of the rulemaking activity that you're seeing now, and you will see throughout the rest of 2026. The White House also, of course, has its agenda. And that includes much of what you've heard in the press or seen elsewhere: dismantling or reducing the department, excluding sexual orientation and gender identity from Title IX. These were right out of the gates. Within hours of the new administration taking office last January. Increasing foreign gifts and ownership transparency, reforming accreditation, which we're going to talk about later, reforming Title VI compliance and enforcement, limiting DEI or illegal DEI efforts and unpatriotic education. And we've seen this in a number of different manifestations, whether that's through PSLF, admissions, efforts, grants, things. All of those are different ways, levers the department has been using to get at its DEI priorities. And then finally, reshaping student visa and exchange programs. So all of that's really coming out of the White House. And then you do have the priorities of the folks over at the department. Of course, the first bullet here, and the thing that directs them most, are implementing and operationalizing what Congress has come up with in the way of OB3 and the directives they're getting out of the White House. But the folks at the department also have their own priorities and sort of desires in terms of forming and shaping policy. And in our view, that includes increasing efficiency in agency operations, implementing accountability and demonstrating results, advanced collection of loan payments and defaults, or advancing collection of loan payments and defaults, prioritizing workforce development and alignment. This is a real theme that we've seen throughout the various rulemakings driving the department, and also addressing a range of regulations that they think can be improved. And that includes around things like changing ownership and the bare minimum rule. So this is sort of your high level view of these three big categories or groups that are all driving the higher ed policy and policy activity that we have seen and we're going to see in 2026. Just really quickly on the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I'm not going to go through all of its provisions. You guys know this was that big piece of legislation that came along, became effective last July 4th. There's a link to it if you haven't seen it. If you go there, just make sure that you're looking at the final enrolled text and not an earlier version. There were 6 subtitles of Title 8. And those were changes that were made to the Higher Education Act. And you can sort of see them here. These are the same things I just went through on the prior slide. If you really want to get into OB3 and learn all about it, we did a 3-part webinar series late summer, early fall, where we went through it. I did one soup to nuts and talked about everything affecting higher ed in OB3. And then we did a big focus on accountability. And then my partner, Chris Murray, who leads our lobbying and policy practice, and I talked about some of the politics surrounding OB3. So I'm not going to go through all of that, but here's a resource if you want to get into that. This also brings us to our very first and magical secret word. Please select the correct word below, and it is snow. Snow, that's a good one. Speaking of which, so I'll tell you my situation. We've got about 15 inches, although today I think it's going to get up to about 30 degrees, but it has been very cold here. I sit physically in St. Louis most of the time, and I spent most of the weekend shoveling snow. I do have 3 very strong and healthy teenagers, and I'm pleased to say that they all did a great job encouraging me as I shoveled snow from the warmth and safety of their rooms. And this is probably a parenting failure on my part. The good news is I'm better at federal regulation and policy than I am at getting teenagers to come out and pick up a shovel. All right, let's keep going. So let's talk about 2026, the negotiated rulemaking, and we'll talk a little bit about what's happened so far, and then we'll talk about where we think we're going to go, and just be thoughtful if you can about all those sort of policy priorities we talked about at Congress and the White House and the U.S. Department of Education. You're going to see them flowing through into all of this rulemaking activity. But first, if you want to track negotiated rulemaking, if you want to look at all the proposals that are being filed, if you want to see all the documentation that's being supplied by the department, including data analysis and PowerPoint presentations, and if you want to find that PPD 26 data set that shows how all these different programs, all these different institutions of higher education are expected to do under the new accountability framework, all of that is here at this page, the negotiated rulemaking 25 page for the U.S. Department of Education. You can get to it by clicking on the picture or any of the links, but everything is there, and everything for the upcoming accreditation rulemaking, all of that stuff we anticipate will still be at this page. Here's what we've had so far. So the first was the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Committee, and you can see the way this is laid out for you, the negotiations. You had one 3-day session, which is fascinating. At least in my career that I can remember, it is the shortest rulemaking that I'm aware of, Title IV rulemaking. It did not reach consensus. The proposed rule came out in August, and the final rule came out August 31st. So it's already on the books. You can go to the Federal Register and find it by clicking that link, and it becomes effective this year on July 1st. I'll talk a little, just very quick. I got one slide on that in a few minutes. The next rulemaking that was convened was the RISE, or Reimagining and Improving Student Education Committee. This committee's purpose, which we'll talk about in a minute, was really to implement OB3 concepts. You had 2 weeks of negotiations. You know, historically, at least again in my career, often negotiations have always been in 3 weeks. And this administration, first you had one 3-day session, and then you had a couple of 2 1-week 5-day sessions. So they're definitely approaching things differently with the purpose, I think, of trying to come to the table with a very strong regulatory proposal and then try to keep people focused on that proposal and get it to consensus with minimal changes. And it's fascinating to watch how this administration has been approaching NEGREG differently, both sort of strategically and tactically to advance their positions. The NPRM is projected in spring 2026, so it hasn't come out yet, right? So the RISE committee met. Again, we're going to talk about it more in a second. We don't have an NPRM yet. My expectation is that the department will very much try to get the final rule out before November 1st of this year so it can become effective next July 1. Similarly, the AHEAD rulemaking committee that I was a part of had 2 1-week or 5-day sessions, one in December, one in January, also reached consensus like the RISE committee, also projected for spring of 26 for an NPRM, and the effective date is July 1, 2027, we anticipate will be. By the way, one of the advantages of committees reaching consensus, not to say that this is a reason for a committee to reach consensus, but for you, the regulated community, one advantage is when the department and the committee reach consensus around a draft text, the pledge on the part of the department is that their proposed rule will look very much like the draft regulatory text that achieved consensus. The advantage there is the regulated community can start examining that draft text and essentially preparing comments right away. When you don't have consensus, you don't know exactly what the department's going to come up with in their proposed rule. So it's harder to start preparing comments until the proposed rule actually arrives. But typically this administration and the prior administration have only been allowing folks 30 days to comment on proposed rules. So the advantage here is both on the RISE and AHEAD committees draft regulatory packages, because they achieve consensus, you as a regulated community can be examining those proposals now. They're on that website I just showed you a second ago. The final text that achieved consensus is on the website for both of those committees, and you can start preparing draft comments. Then when the proposed rule comes out, all you have to do is see, did it change at all? It really shouldn't. Any changes should be minor, and that gives you a much, 60, 90 days to work on your comments. Whereas when, again, you have a rule that doesn't achieve consensus or draft text that doesn't achieve consensus, you really have to wait until the proposed rule comes out, in some respects at least, to start drafting your comments. Okay, here are the other 2 rulemakings that are on their way. The first is the Accreditation, Innovation, and Modernization Committee, or AIM. Just showed up in the Federal Register this morning. Unofficial version hit yesterday, the news wires. They're talking about 2 5-day sessions that will be in April and May of 2026. We anticipate this NPRM in the fall. I'm going to talk about it in a few minutes. I mean, I think the department is very focused on this accreditation concept, but for OB3, I think it would have been potentially their very first rulemaking, because this is a White House objective. Remember back to the chart I showed you earlier with the 3 columns and the priorities. But what happened was when OB3 came along, the department had to sort of, put the brakes on its regulatory agenda because it had a number of things under OB3 that are going to become effective July 1 of 26. So it sort of had to push out the rulemakings that were attached to White House priorities and insert a couple of rulemakings that were being driven largely by the congressional priorities included in OB3. So that's why I think accreditation, notwithstanding the fact that it is a major priority of the White House, is only now showing up. It could be that the department tries very hard to get a final rule on the books by November 1st, but I think that's going to be really hard. They've got major resource constraints. They've got to get regulations through that pertain to OB3 because so many of its provisions take effect this July 1. So I think they're going to still have to prioritize all the RISE committee and AHEAD committee rules. Now, because those committees reach consensus, in a sense, there's less work for them to do. Right? Because they don't have to come up with new text and justify it. They've already sort of done that, but it's still a lot of work to get 2 major regulatory packages through. Really 3. My expectation is you'll see 1 around the RISE topics, and then you'll probably see 2 broken out over the AHEAD topics, 1 about Pell and workforce Pell, and a separate one about accountability. So I'm sort of envisioning maybe 3 proposed rules over the next 2 to 3 months, but that just means accreditation is going to be harder to get to for the department. I think it would be a huge ask. I'm not saying impossible, but a huge ask for them to get through NEGREG, right, in May, get a proposed rule out on top of everything else they're doing, and then get through comment and get a final rule in place by November 1. That seems a real stretch. So we're anticipating July 1st, 2028 would be the earliest that these accreditation rules could take effect. And then we have what I call the kitchen sink committee. This really is just an Aaron term, but it's my way of saying I think they're going to have a final rulemaking here that's going to sort of pull in everything that hasn't been covered up to the kitchen sink, right? All these other little topics. You could call this the loose ends committee, whatever. Negotiations, I would anticipate, again, a 2-week, 5-day session format. I had said April and May here. Maybe it gets bumped a little further now that we know where accreditation is going to be. I'm again saying fall 2026 if they can work it in, and July 1, 2028. But it is the furthest out and the one of least priority compared to everything else we've discussed. All right, so let's just talk about these in a little bit more detail. Just a slide here on PSLF. I think, it's important institutions and your students, but day to day, it doesn't impact most of you what you do, right, as institutions. This is really more about what students can accomplish after they graduate with the department and qualifying employers. I mean, the idea here, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone. I think it's all very clear. The department wanted to, and the White House really wanted to tighten the box around which employers would qualify for this program and to try to exclude employers that are engaged in activities with which they disagree. Now, some of these obviously are activities with which I think we all would disagree: terrorism, chemical and surgical castration, et cetera. But then there are others like violations of federal immigration laws and illegal discrimination, where this administration's views on what fits into that bucket might be different from what many others think about what should fit in that bucket. So I think they were trying to essentially say, we want a smaller group of employers who are more aligned with our priorities to be available for public service loan forgiveness. And that's essentially what they've done. You'll see the last bullet here. I mean, there's still a lot of unknowns, practically speaking, potential implications for borrowers working in complex or mission-driven service settings. I think it's going to be hard for some borrowers to understand and have confidence that their employer is or is not inside the lines. There's also uncertainty regarding the eligibility of organizations serving undocumented immigrants and transgender individuals, right? And that goes to this lack of clarity around exactly what some of these concepts mean. So much of that to be determined, I think, in guidance, et cetera, coming forward this year. The RISE committee. So this committee was convened very clearly to negotiate regulations that would clarify and implement provisions of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. So like I said, RISE and AHEAD were sort of inserted into the department's rulemaking agenda in order to get ahead of, no pun intended, and create regulations to implement OB3. So specifically, RISE was considering the new loan program terminations, limitations, simplification of student loan repayment plans, flexibility to apply lower annual limits for student parent borrowers for institutions, and modifications to loan rehabilitation. Let's just skip through these in a little more detail in case you're not someone who's been spending a lot of time around OB3. So when we talk about loan terminations and limitations, certainly for institutions, the most impactful concepts here, you've got the termination of the Grad Plus loan program, July 1 of this year, new annual and aggregate limits for graduate and professional loans, which of course for the first time drew this distinction between those concepts. What is a graduate program and what's a professional program? And we're going to talk about that in a minute. New annual and aggregate limits for Parent Plus loans as well. The Grad Plus loans, obviously the primary impact there is on graduate level programming, but limits for Parent Plus loans, is impacting all of higher education. And then new lifetime maximum aggregate loan limits for all students. Again, if you want to get into the details of all of that, you can look at the RISE draft regulatory text. You can go back and watch our webinar all about OB3. But again, these are very impactful changes that are going to take place July 1 of this year, most of them. Institutional authority to limit loans. This is a very interesting new concept. We've talked with some clients about it. Schools have asked for it for many years. On the other hand, now that it's here, most of the folks I've talked to seem to think it may not be such a great tool. Interesting. At any rate, the idea is institutions will be able for the first time to say, this is the loan limit for students in this program. You have to treat all students the same way. But the idea is you could actually say, we're only going to make $5,000 of loans available for this program or $10,000. So if you felt like you had a lot of over borrowing in a particular program, maybe based on the program design or the type of student that you're typically getting, and you've really felt like you needed to limit that borrowing, institutions now will have some ability to do that. And that is statutory, as is loan proration for less than full time. I mean, the short story here is, for the first time, institutions are going to be required to prorate annual loan amounts in proportion to the percent of full-time status the student is enrolled. I've got the text here for you in the little bullet that's a little more specific. And down in the right-hand corner, in a lot of cases, keep in mind the changes OB3 made. Those changes it became effective. It's statute, not regulation. So it became effective on the day it was enacted. And those changes have already been made into the United States Code. So I've got the site here in the bottom right-hand corner where you can go in the current United States Code and see this language and where these changes have been made. Loan repayment, the big story here I mentioned earlier is just the transition from what has become an increasingly complex repayment scheme to a more a simplified one, or a more simplified one. I don't know if simple is the right word. You can see there were essentially are right now essentially 3 fixed repayment plans in the world: standard repayment, graduate repayment, extended repayment. And then you have 4 different income-driven repayment plans. A couple of these are statutory, and a couple of them were regulatory creations by the prior administration. OB3 basically said we're gonna simplify all of this. There's a fairly complicated transition plan over a period of the next 2 to 3 years where students can move around from certain plans to other plans. And then at one point they can no longer move into other types of plans. I talk about that some in my OB3 presentation. And of course, the RISE committee talked about that at length. But the key idea here is at the end of these 2 to 3 years, everybody is going to be moving and focused in on 2 new plans that Congress has set out. You've got sort of a new standard repayment plan, and the other is Congress's new version of sort of an income contingent idea, which is the repayment assistant plan, or the RAP. RISE, I mentioned earlier, reach consensus. And if you want to see that draft regulatory text, again, it's on the NEGREG 2025 page. You can also click this link right here, and there's the front cover of some of that language. The big issue, though, that came up, and I would be remiss not to talk about it for a second here, is what is a professional degree? And I mentioned earlier, you know, it has for years been the case that there has been a definition in the law as to what constitutes a professional degree. And most institutions quite appropriately didn't think a lot about it. I mean, you had IPEDS reporting in some other places where you had to sort of characterize programs as once upon a time first-time professional, and then that sort of went away, but there was still a professional concept. But there weren't really any stakes attached to this distinction between a graduate program and professional degree program. And of course, there are some concepts at the master's degree level or even undergraduate degree level that could be considered professional programs. So all that was kind of squishy. And then OB3 came along and said, well, we're going to draw a hard distinction, and it's going to impact loan limits, right? If you're a graduate program, the new aggregate loan limit's $100,000. For professional programs, $200,000. So understandably, schools said, well, wait a minute, is my program graduate or professional? And Congress in OB3 says, hey, go look at this definition to find your answer. This got into a big point of contention, and it was interpreted by some. I don't mean to smile. I apologize, but I really don't mean to smile, but I think the higher ed folks out here will appreciate that there was a large community of folks, including nurses and others, who are not really part of these higher ed, you know, wonky conversations, who I think took offense to the idea that maybe their program was not being labeled as professional. In some cases, even when we were talking about undergraduate programming, which doesn't even come into play with regard to these loan limits. This picture that is on this screen, just to give you a sense as to how pervasive this conversation is, my son sent me this because this had been posted on the electronic bulletin board by one of his teachers in one of his classes at school. And he texted me and he said, hey, is this one of those things that you ever talk about? So actually, this is one of them. And this was an article from Snopes, which was inspecting this whole controversy and, you know, how much of it was true and how much of it wasn't true. At any rate, the key idea here is there is a distinction being drawn between graduate programs and professional degree programs, and it does in fact loan limits. So what this is really about is, as you all, many of you know, what level of loans your students can receive. And that's consequential. There are, of course, graduate programs out there that cost more than $100,000 to get through. And so this has been a very important topic for institutions of higher education. To the surprise of many, myself included, the department began the first day of the RISE rulemaking and rolled out a new definition of professional degree. Now, the main reason I was surprised by that is because OB3 actually specifically says that the department is to use the current definition of professional degree at 34 CFR 668.2 to make this delineation. And so it was surprising to me when the statutory language, by the way, it still says that. The statute even now says It literally specifically says the department has to use the version of the statute that's in effect on July 1, 2025, or July 4th, 2025, when OB3 became effective. But the department during rulemaking said, well, actually, we're going to throw out a new definition. So again, it was a surprise to many. And the other big surprise was the existing definition is illustrative, meaning it sort of has a couple of qualitative concepts. It says a professional degree is, a degree like this or like that. And then it has a list of examples. And the department wanted to change that and make it an exhaustive list. In other words, saying these are the only degrees that are included and labeled as professional degrees. At the end of 2 weeks of rulemaking, the committee did reach consensus. There was a much, or I'll just say an expanded definition. But the truth of the matter is the expanded definition that reached consensus with really only one or two changes is very similar in practice and impact to what the department started with. And so you've got this longer definition on your screen, but the key here is a professional degree is a degree that, and then you see box number 2 still says may be awarded in the following fields. So the way this has been constructed, it's still an exhaustive list. In other words, if your program is not on this list, it can't be deemed a professional program for purposes of loan limits, right? So an institution can certainly still call a program a professional program. And you'll see, for example, MBA is not on this list. I think most people will still call an MBA a professional program and would agree that it is one. This is really just about loan limits, but that, of course, is still a very important topic. By the way, we're going to talk in a minute about commenting, right? Public comment period. And one point I just do want to make is even when draft text reaches consensus, it's still possible for the department. So the department commits that its proposed rule, the notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRM, when it comes out, it's going to be based very closely on the draft text that reached consensus. But you then have a public comment period. The department is obligated under the law to review all those comments, and it can make changes to the final rule based on the comments that are received. So please understand, just because a committee reached consensus does not mean that your comments can have no impact on the final rule. They absolutely can. And it's very important if you have strong feelings about that professional degree designation or any other aspects of what the RISE committee discussed, you still have an opportunity when public comment opens to express those opinions. And we'll talk about maybe best practices for that in a bit. First, though, let's return to the AHEAD committee. This was the committee that I was a part of. Again, this committee was convened very clearly to clarify and implement some of the new provisions of OB3, specifically in this case, some minor changes to Pell eligibility, the establishment of a regulatory framework around the new workforce Pell program concept, and then changes to accountability measures. So the One Big Beautiful Bill Act included a new accountability framework. And of course, you already have this financial value, transparency, and gainful employment framework out there. And one of the things the AHEAD committee was tasked with doing was trying to figure out how to integrate the two in a way that reflected congressional intent. Let's just talk through these real quickly with a little more specificity. So I mentioned Pell eligibility and the non-federal aid threshold. A lot of folks were thrown when OB3 came out. It said effective July 1st, 26, a student is no longer eligible for a Pell grant for any period for which the student receives grant aid from non-federal sources, states, institutions of higher ed, or private sources, in an amount that equals or exceeds the student's cost of attendance for such period. So I think, historically, a lot of institutions, Pell has always been Pell first, right? It's the cornerstone. That's the idea. And so you would get Pell eligibility settled, and then institutions would sort of look at other aid concepts, loans, et cetera, and then institutional aid and maybe other forms of scholarship would sort of come in at the end. And when folks first saw this, I think this notion was this is going to flip all that on his head. As a practical matter, I really don't think that it will. I think the idea is you can still, package a student. You get an idea as to what the student's financial aid profile is going to be, right? Schools have different things that the tuition package or projection or whatever you might call it. But the notion is you can still, you still say, yes, they're eligible for Pell. You can build out your other institutional aid. But what the department is saying here is if you have a situation at the beginning of the term when you're going through that exercise or any point during the term where you discover that the student has access to non-federal aid in an amount that exceeds their entire cost of attendance. And by the way, that's not with the Pell Grant included. That's without the Pell Grant. So we're talking about not, just to be very clear, we're not saying cost of attendance minus the Pell Grant. We're saying they have access to non-federal aid in an amount that exceeds their entire cost of attendance without taking a Pell Grant into consideration. At that point, the Pell Grant would have to be returned. But the way the regulatory framework works, institutions would have some time to try to look to see if that non-federal aid sources could be reduced so that you can bring it back down under the cost of attendance and the student can keep the Pell Grant. So I don't think this is going to represent a radical change to packaging. I mean, I think you can still sort of package students in the way that you traditionally would, but certainly if you have student athletes and others where, out of the gates that they have access to non-federal aid that's going to exceed their entire cost of attendance, in those cases, you would know up front that they're not going to be eligible for a Pell Grant. In most other cases, I think you would have a pretty good idea. You would probably work with employers, your institution, and other non-federal aid sources to try to ensure that you're not going over cost of attendance. If you do, there's some ability to try to make adjustments. But at the end of the day, if those adjustments can't be made and the student does have enough funding to cover the entire cost of attendance, not just tuition fees, whole cost of attendance, without Pell included, right? At that point, the Pell would have to be returned. So I don't mean to make it sound easy, but hopefully it will not be as disruptive to institutions as I think some of us thought it would be when this language first came across. The other big concept that we talked about in the first week of the head committee meeting was the regulatory infrastructure to put around eligible workforce programs. This is a new, very short form. And just to be clear, it's not a new type of aid. So this isn't like a new kind of Pell Grant. This is just the Pell Grant, but eligibility is now being extended to a much shorter type of program, which is an eligible workforce program, right? So then the question becomes, well, what do you have to do to be qualified as an eligible workforce program? And Congress in the statute included a number of pretty significant barriers to entry. Right. So, and I'm not going to go into all of that right now, but I'll just say it's not going to be easy. And I'm going to show you in a minute here. I did an entire debrief presentation, 90 minutes on that first week of ahead and talked a lot more about that eligible workforce program. But I think my takeaway and a lot of the negotiators' takeaway was there will be some institutions that will figure out a way to do this that makes sense and is really useful. I think a lot of folks will look at what it takes to get into it and get something qualified as an eligible workforce program, and then look at sort of the requirements to maintain that eligibility, and may decide, to quote one of my other negotiators, that the juice isn't worth the squeeze. That's just something that each institution will have to evaluate. The other big topic that was discussed by HEAD was the accountability framework. I'm not going to go through all of it. Those of you who listen to me know I talk a lot about accountability. I'll do the 2-slide version. So the statutory framework had essentially 2 key components. One was a single accountability test for degree programs and graduate certs. And specifically, that's an earnings premium test. So the idea was, if you're a degree program, undergraduate degree, graduate degree, or graduate certificate program, everyone's going to be measured using this earnings premium. And your graduates are going to have to demonstrate that their sort of median income for a given cohort exceeds this the applicable earnings threshold. And that threshold would be, for undergraduates, that's folks who've only graduated from high school within a certain age range. And for graduate students, it's folks who only have a bachelor's degree. It's clearly more complicated than that, but that's the basic concept. The other important component here is that the sanction for all Title IV programs, because remember, this applies to all Title IV degree programs and graduate certificates, the sanction is a loss of access to direct loans. And this was the first time in my experience, I believe, that certainly Congress or even the department had ever advanced an accountability framework in law. There may have been bills introduced in the past, but actually advanced in law an accountability framework that could put direct loan access in jeopardy for undergraduate and graduate degree programs throughout all of higher education. So the HEAD committee put a regulatory framework around the statutory framework. Here are the main components. You still got disclosure and reporting requirements. And remember, this is also integrating that financial value transparency and gainful employment stuff that's already out there. This will replace that and also take the new statutory framework and sort of synthesize it all into one thing moving forward. So you still have the disclosure and reporting requirements that look a lot like what you were doing under financial value transparency and gainful employment. You still got this program information website out there where the department is going to publish a lot of data about your institution and programs, including whether they pass this earning premium. You have one earnings premium test for all Title IV programs. So the statutory framework created by Congress, I mentioned a second ago, applies to degree programs and graduate certificates. The department would extend this to undergraduate certificates, so meaning like non-degree programs as well, just sort of extending that same framework using the gainful employment statutory rationale. And then finally, sanctions for all Title IV programs. Everyone could lose access to direct loans if they fail to meet the test. And if you have a very high percentage of programs losing access, you actually could have an administrative capability finding on top of that, and ultimately lose additional access even to Pell Grants. Okay. The AHEAD committee also reached consensus. If you want to see the final consensus language, again, it is currently available on the department's external website, which you can reach by clicking that picture or the link. And I did 2 debrief webinars. In fact, some of you are probably saying, feels like there's been a whole lot of Aaron in the last 6 weeks, and you're right, there has been. I'll try to take a break here. I don't want to overburden people with too much of this, but I tried to do a debrief after each week of the AHEAD committee meetings. So the first one, you can click on this link, was all about the workforce Pell stuff. And the second one, which I did just 2 weeks ago, is I think we did 2 hours on the new accountability framework. So if you really want to get into the weeds and all of that, please feel free to do so. And by the way, at least with regard to accountability, I would suggest that you should. I think it's going to be, as I say during that presentation, I think it's going to go, meaning I think it is going to stick, and the department is going to get through 2 rounds of calculations, at least for degree programs and graduate certs. I mean, if there's going to be a litigation challenge that's successful, it's probably only for the non-degree program component, and even that's going to be a challenge. But I think it's definitely going to go for graduate, undergraduate degree programs and graduate certificates. And by go, I mean like make 2 rounds, and schools are going to, or certain programs I think will lose direct loan eligibility. So you need to be planning for that, understanding which programs are likely to be affected. The department projects it's only about 5.5% of programs overall that are going to be affected, but there are certain types of programs that are disproportionately impacted, particularly when you look at the bachelor's degree and graduate degree level, you know, music, religious studies, fine arts, studio arts. If you've got a program where when people graduate, they are often doing gig work or self-employed, you should be checking out this accountability framework. Okay, here is today's secret word number 2. It is winter. Oh, I sense a theme. I sense a theme. So we've got 3 options: fall, winter, and spring. And that middle option there, B, is winter. And if you are tuning in for continuing legal education credit, I would invite you to take a moment and click the square, the radio button B for winter. So I want to make sure you get your credit. And by the way, I'll just say for all the folks who are out there who were hit by these cold temperatures, I hope you're as safe and sound as you can be. If you're watching this webinar, I assume you have some electricity, which is good. If you know someone who wants to watch this webinar and does not have electricity, it will be on YouTube in the future, but that's probably the least of their priorities right now. More priority is probably getting their heat back along with their electricity. So in all seriousness, I hope everybody is safe and sound. I hope you're getting dug out. I know down south where they get a lot of ice, in particular, I'm a Louisiana native. You don't get a lot of winter compared to, say, you know, way up north, but it is definitely the case that when it comes, it can be damaging. So again, just hope everybody is safe. Okay, moving right along. Let's talk about the brand new committee on the block that was just announced this morning. But before we do, let's talk about sort of the road up to this committee. So on April 23rd of 2025, you may recall there was a whole slew of executive orders that were issued all at once that had to do with higher education. One of those was the Reforming Accreditation to Strengthen Higher Education executive order. And it did not mince words. So in that April 23rd executive order, the president accused accreditors of failing in their responsibility to students, families, and American taxpayers and abusing their enormous authority. That executive order references poor student outcomes, rising debt, and asserts that accreditors have remained improperly focused on compelling adoption of discriminatory ideology rather than on student outcomes. It also states that federal recognition will not be provided to accreditors engaging in unlawful discrimination in violation of federal law. So lots of strong words, lots of assertions of deficiencies on the part of accreditors, and a number of not so veiled threats. Among other things, the executive order directed the department to take specific steps to reform accreditation, including recognizing new accreditors, simplifying the process to change institutional accreditors, which we've already talked about, and investigating certain accreditors for discriminatory practices, And the ABA and I think LCME were both called out pretty specifically. It also directs the secretary to mandate that accreditors require institutions to focus on program level student outcomes to improve the process for the department's review and recognition of accreditors, and to hold accountable accreditors that fail to comply with recognition requirements. So why are they just now getting around to this rulemaking? Again, because OB3 came on, right? So this executive order comes out in April, but then Congress says, hey, we got all this stuff we want you to do, and it has to be ready by July 1 of next year. So the department has to sort of pump the brakes on the White House priorities and insert a couple of rulemakings to effectuate OB3. And now they're getting back to these White House priorities that were articulated last spring. So this morning in the Federal Register, the department announced its intent to establish a negotiated rulemaking committee, and it's calling it, all of these acronyms are so good, Accreditation, Innovation, and Modernization Committee. And if you want to go check out that Federal Register announcement, you can click on this link or the picture. Topics to be covered. I'm going to go through this in a little more detail than I normally do. I know this is a lot of text, but this is important. I mean, they're all important, to be sure. Accountability is impactful, for certain, the loan limits. But I think that this rulemaking is one that folks should really be paying attention to, because I think that a number of the priorities that the White House has articulated around not only just higher education in general, but also specifically around, DEI and faculty and diversity in faculty and thought and all those types of things. I think you're going to see a lot of that manifested in this proposed rulemaking package. So let's just talk about some of the things. And by the way, it's really interesting. Like when the department put out its intent or notice for proposed rulemaking, not notice for proposed rulemaking, its intent to form a rulemaking committee for AHEAD and for RISE. In those notices, if you look, like when it talks about the topics to be covered, it's fairly succinct. I mean, there's 5 or 6 and it's a sentence or 2 each. I mean, there's like 10 different issue items in this, and they are, I'll just say it's much more robust in how the department is describing what it's looking to do. Recognition of new accrediting agencies that reduce competition and institutional choice. So a lot of these issue areas also include the implication of deficiency on the part of the accrediting community. Procedures for institutions to change accrediting agencies so that institutions are not forced to comply with standards that are antithetical to their values and missions. Emphasizing criteria and standards requirements that effectively focus on student achievement and outcomes, high educational quality and high value programs, and removing criteria that are anti-competitive, discriminatory, or which contribute to credential inflation and escalating tuition costs. Requiring all accrediting agencies and associations to have standards that consider program level student achievement and outcomes data to improve such outcomes without reference to race, ethnicity, or sex. Ensuring that accrediting agency procedures for taking action on noncompliance findings resulting from OCR investigations under Title VI or Title IX provide for expeditious resolution and actions. So, for example, if the accrediting agency does not have standards that the department believes are pushing for expeditious resolution of its actions, it might take action against that accrediting agency. It's important to sort of understand the dynamics here. Review of the role that accrediting agency standards have played in promoting violations of federal law, including unlawful discrimination by member institutions under the guise of accreditation standards for DEI. Expansion of current regulations on accreditation standards for faculty to include support for and appropriate prioritization of intellectual diversity amongst faculty in order to advance academic freedom, intellectual inquiry, and student achievement and learning outcomes. If you go back and look at the, you guys may remember there was the document that the White House was floating last fall that it was encouraging some institutions to examine and potentially sign on to. You can go back and look at some of the agreements that the administration wanted Harvard, for example, to sign on to that were public last spring. And you'll see a lot of these same themes there around intellectual diversity among faculty, illegal DEI, et cetera. My expectation is, and I don't think this is earth-shattering insight, the department's indicated that in addition to the typical constituencies, one other point, and then we'll get to the second and third bullet here, but also as part of this announcement, the department has indicated that they're going to include negotiators from NASIKI, so 2 people who are current members of NASIKI, as well as a non-voting advisor, quote, who has expert subject matter expertise on accreditation and quality assurance, which is interesting. During the president's campaign, some of you may remember there was a video that got a fair amount of that the president recorded as part of the campaign and disseminated. And it was all about higher ed. And he observed during that video that accreditation would be the, quote, secret weapon for reclaiming higher education from the radical left. There's a lot more discussion that was the succinct version of it. Those types of comments followed by the executive order, the bold agenda outlined in the rulemaking notice. And actually earlier today, my understanding is the undersecretary gave, there's already been some coverage of it, had remarks to CHIA at their annual conference, and also took a pretty hard line. I think that this rulemaking is going to be, I didn't put highly here, but highly politicized, I'll say spirited and consequential. And so I really encourage institutions to pay attention. Not just during rulemaking, of course, you'll have an opportunity to engage in public comment. But then after that, rulemaking is complete, these rules become final, your accreditors will have to go through their processes for updating their standards, and you can also participate in that process. And I think it's going to be really important for institutions to be involved and engaged in commenting on this rulemaking and future standards revisions on the part of your accreditors. On a related note, by the way, the current unified agenda, which is the big thing that the federal government puts out every year, a bunch of agencies say this is all the proposed and regular rulemaking we intend to go through. The current unified agenda indicates that in 2026, the Department of Health and Human Services intends to promote a new rule titled Reforming Accreditation to Strengthen Graduate Medical Education. That's really all we know. It's just the blurb in the unified agenda, but the new rule, it says, quote, will address regulations related to HHS graduate medical education funding and new accrediting bodies. So clearly, I think part of this big picture, but not taking place in connection with the U.S. Department of Education's rulemaking, taking place over at HHS. So let's talk about the Kitchen Sink Committee. I just have one slide here. We believe the department's going to convene a neg reg. We've had a lot of conversations, including with folks over at the department about this. And I don't think this is top secret. Like there were comments being made in and around neg reg, including where I think the press and others are present, just around the idea of having a catch-all rulemaking towards the end of this process. If you look at the unified agenda, there is a line item for, sort of Title IV changes, et cetera. So I think the idea would be sort of a catch-all, and it would include, we anticipate, rules governing change of ownership, cash management, administrative capability standards, financial responsibility requirements. So lots of revisions, some of which will be to make conforming changes that go along with some of the other bigger changes that are already being made, like by accountability and RISE, et cetera. And then also, I think, to clean up and improve and maybe improve some of the efficiencies that are present in some of these other regulations. Specific rules that may be reconsidered during this rulemaking, we think includes the PPA signatory requirement. Some of you that operate in the world of mergers and acquisitions know that the department just, I think it was last week or the week before, announced a new policy around PPA signatory requirements for parent entities. That sort of came out of a lawsuit that occurred right here in Missouri down the road involving Hannibal LaGrange, one of the Baptist institutions here in the state of Missouri, and its parent, the Missouri Baptist Convention. And so what's interesting is, I think when folks think about, parent relationships between schools and sort of corporate parent entities, they're often thinking about in the proprietary context, which of course does exist. But it also exists when you talk about a lot of hospitals and nursing schools and faith-based institutions and churches. It is not, and now with the increasing number of mergers and affiliations, we have private nonprofit systems. So it is not exclusively a concern for proprietary schools by any stretch of the imagination. The other thing that we anticipate that might be addressed as part of this kitchen sink committee would be the bare minimum rule. Right. And that one's been out there and sort of percolating and tied up in litigation, but it's not being enforced right now. And we think that this administration has an interest in addressing it. So let's talk about beyond negotiated rulemaking. Aaron, what could be beyond negotiated rulemaking? I mean, isn't that where it all happens? Well, certainly that's where all the cool kids hang out, but there are other things happening beyond neg reg. So just as a reminder, Section 492 of the Higher Education Act requires that all regulations pertaining to Title IV have to go through neg reg, right? And this is an unusual requirement. The U.S. Department of Education, there are only a couple of other agencies in all of the federal government, which are very small agencies, that have obligations to engage in neg reg. I mean, the U.S. Department of Ed is clearly the only sort of major agency that has to do this. It's why all these Title IV rules. In fact, it was funny. There was someone from the Department of Labor present during the ahead negotiated rulemaking. At one point, sort of commented, "Why do you guys go through all of this? Because it's such an unusual thing for most other agencies in the federal government to see this convening of people and this whole process." But what is important to appreciate, and sometimes is forgotten, is that this requirement only relates to regulations that are carrying out Title IV, meaning the statutes that are part of Title IV of the Higher Education Act. There's no express requirement for negotiated rulemaking when the department is revising, introducing, implementing statutes that are outside of Title IV. And there's quite a bit that sits outside of Title IV that they manage. The department has signaled that they intend to engage in several rulemakings that would sit outside of Title IV, which suggests that they may not go through negotiated rulemaking, but rather will just manifest in the form of a notice of proposed rulemaking, maybe a public hearing or two, that kind of thing. So what are we talking about? Foreign gifts and contracts. Recall back on April 23rd, when we had that slew of executive orders, another one focused on increasing enforcement of the existing HEA requirements that institutions report significant sources of foreign funding. So the department recently launched a new foreign funding reporting portal. I don't know if you've seen that. I mean, I think that was literally the beginning of this month, so 2 weeks ago. And the current unified agenda indicates that in 26, we can expect proposed rules, quote, covering institutions reporting of statutorily defined gifts, contracts, and or restricted and conditional gifts or contracts with defined foreign sources. So just a minute here. So you probably won't see a committee convened for neg reg, but what you will likely see is a proposed rule upon which you can comment, right, or on which you can comment. Disparate impact liability. Another one of those April 23rd executive orders. And remember, that whole slew of executive orders was really designed to tee up, or not designed to tee up neg reg, but the expectation was neg reg would flow from it. And that was interrupted once again by OB3. So we're kind of getting back to a lot of that, right? So one of them was also highly critical of disparate impact liability, observing, quote, that it is wholly inconsistent with the Constitution, threatens the commitment to merit and equality of opportunity that forms the foundation of the American dream, and directed the Attorney General and others in particular to go about evaluating programming and rules, implementing regulations under Title VI to the extent that they contemplate disparate impact liability. The current unified agenda indicates that in 26, again, the department intends to, quote, remove the regulation under Title VI that utilizes a disparate impact theory of race-based discrimination. So be on the lookout for that proposed rule. Enforcement of civil rights laws in general. So in 2025, as is well known, I mean, we had a number of significant executive orders that talked about illegal DEI. We had various policy announcements and other things emanating from various federal agencies, all on this topic. It clearly has impacted, grant management, federal grant management, things of that nature. The current unified agenda also suggests that in 26, the department intends to, quote, amend procedural regulations that apply to administrative enforcement under Title VI and under Title IX to better ensure that such procedures are consistent with statutory requirements while streamlining the process by which OCR seeks termination of federal financial assistance to institutions that intentionally violate federal civil rights laws. So I think what we can expect is, I mean, first of all, the department can do quite a bit here at the sub-regulatory level, right? Meaning that the department can direct its investigators to act certain ways or pursue certain policies or approaches. And that has been the case from one administration to the next, by the way. That's not unique to this administration. But what I think we're talking about here is actually more formal rulemaking, pursuant to which that the department intends to create rules around how some of these investigations should be carried out. And part of the reason they may be doing that is precisely because they want this to be governed by regulation. Keep in mind that, and we saw this when the Obama administration, released a great deal of guidance around the management of Title IX investigations. And then the first Trump administration, within just a few months of coming into office, just stripped that all off the books. And one of the lessons there was sub-regulatory guidance is easily removed. It's not subject to the APA for the most part. You can rescind it quickly. And I think this administration understands that. And so one of the reasons they are trying to create enforcement directives, not just in sub-regulatory guidance, but in actual regulation, is because they want it to have more staying power and to be harder for a subsequent administration to reverse it or undo it. FERPA regulations. I feel like every administration is always rewriting the FERPA regulations. It seems like my colleagues who follow FERPA closely are always telling me, there's a new FERPA rule coming. But it is true that the unified agenda indicates that in 26, the department does intend to improve FERPA by clarifying the definition of education record, provisions governing non-consensual disclosure of PII, disclosures in response to law enforcement warrants or judicial subpoenas. We have a blog post we did a decade ago on that topic, and it is consistently gets more hits than almost any other blog post we've ever done. This idea of FERPAs and warrants and judicial subpoenas, and the complaint and investigation procedures and remedies that apply to the department's enforcement of FERPA. So actually quite a bit of movement, it feels like, around FERPA could be forthcoming. Expanded reporting. We've talked a little bit about this previously. In response to the president's August 7th, 2025 memo, it wasn't really an executive order proper, ensuring transparency in higher ed admissions. The department's already taking steps to expand IPEDS reporting to include this new admissions and consumer transparency supplement. Also, I mentioned earlier the accountability rule that recently achieved consensus as part of the AHEAD committee maintains most of the reporting obligations that already exist under financial value transparency and gainful employment, and adds to them, in case you did not catch this, the requirement that at least on a going forward basis, all institutions of higher education will have to report any new programs through the department's electronic application, and it will then be included on their e-card, any new program that you want to have access to direct loans. But, in traditional higher ed, public, private, nonprofit institutions historically have not had to, in most circumstances, have not been required to report new undergraduate degree or graduate degree programs. And the proposal here on the table is that all of that would have to be reported within 10 days. Mainly just a reporting burden. I mean, I don't think it's certainly something institutions can manage, but it's just one more thing added to the already considerable administrative burden that you guys manage. Student and exchange visitors changes, sort of consistent with this administration's efforts to be sort of constantly revising and shaping how we manage immigration in this country and non-immigrants who are visiting this country. We expect that this administration will continue to be thoughtful about the student exchange visitor program. Now, this is outside of the department. This is going to be over at DHS and the State Department. But in that unified agenda, there are also announcements regarding efforts to change the admission period for FJ and I visas for duration of status to an admission for a fixed period of time, which will be interesting to see because it's always been duration of status, like while you're studying. DHS revisions to the practical training regulations are anticipated, although the scope isn't entirely clear. And then State Department efforts to increase the maximum deductible for health insurance for exchange visitors and their dependents, which was an interesting side note I read somewhere. But it just noted that, those changes could impact for you institutions that actually provide health plans that include your exchange visitors and their dependents, or student visitors and their dependents. It could impact like the nature of those plans and whether they offer the coverage that's required. Finally, federal grant making. I'm giving this short shrift, I feel like, because there's so much that's been going on here. Jana Rust and Brent Hill on our team have done a tremendous amount of work around grant making in the last year for a lot of institutions and are really the experts in that area. There was an August 7th executive order that directed the OMB to revise the uniform guidance, which sort of directs all the different federal agencies that manage grant making to include limiting the use of grant funds for indirect costs and requiring all discretionary grants to permit termination for convenience, including when the award no longer advances agency priorities or the national interest. I think there's a lot of concern there for a lot of different reasons, which I think are actually pretty self-evident as to how that discretion might be used. We also expect multiple federal agencies, including the department, to continue to revise their rules and policies governing grant making to accord with that August executive order, as well as with other administration priorities, including around illegal DEI. So all of this is to say, we continue to think in 2026 that grant making is going to be one of those places. I mean, it's a place where the federal government, they have their hands on the purse strings, and it is a tool or a lever they can use to advance ideological or other political priorities, right? And we anticipate that will continue. It has been the case and will continue to be the case. Let's talk just briefly, we're here at the end, and then we'll do questions about impact opportunities. First of all, as far as like rulemaking goes, and here I'm really talking about mainly negotiated rulemaking, but it's not exclusively to negotiated rulemaking. So coordinate with trade associations. I think that's really important. You can participate in public meetings, and you can nominate or serve as a negotiator. That's a really important opportunity, and it really is critically important that higher education and all the different constituency communities have strong people at the table. You can schedule meetings with the department, by the way. I mentioned at the outset that while the department is still woefully under-resourced, it is clearly a priority of this administration to be available to institutions of higher education. And so if you know, or your president, and I think it is impactful if you can get senior leadership there, you know, certainly if you're in coordination with your trade associations or even directly want to reach out to the department and try to schedule meetings, I think that can be done. We have done it on behalf of clients, and I would encourage you to be thoughtful about it. You know, making sure that those meetings are as constructive as possible, of course. You can support negotiators during NEGREG. I mean, that process has changed a lot over the last 15 or 20 years. Even when I did it last in 2017, prior to most recently, you would show up during the day. I was actually quoted somewhere recently saying this, but it's true. You would show up during the day and you'd be there from 9 to 4, and you would respond to questions from the partner, reflect on things. And then when you were done, you were done. I mean, you would meet with other negotiators and maybe talk over things. But I remember when I was there in 2017, one day across 3 whole weeks, one person that I can recall actually offered up some draft language. And we all sort of thought, boy, what a teacher's pet. Went home and actually drafted some regulatory text. Now, every night, negotiators are drafting regulatory text and talking with their constituency groups and trade associations, and you know, they're trying to evaluate data. And while I was serving for private nonprofits, you know, ACE and NICU and others were helping me crunch data and be thoughtful about different opportunities. I mean, it was just a, you know, apart from when you were sleeping, a 24/7 exercise. So it's critically important that you have people at the table who are willing to do that. But also, if you are someone who have the skill sets to analyze data sets, or that have particular experience around something like workforce Pell programming, and you can reach out to a negotiator and say, I'm here as a resource, that's valuable. And that is absolutely a way that you can participate. You can comment on proposals directly, of course. You can encourage others to comment, meaningful comments. You can schedule an EO 12866 meeting with OMB. So this is often sort of later in the process, maybe after a comment period is closed. The OMB is still going to hold meetings, and there is a right that you have to try to schedule one of those meetings. And of course, even after a rule becomes final, you can challenge a rule through litigation, or you can help fund the folks who are doing that. But there's a lot of different ways you can have impact on the rulemaking process. Let's just talk quickly about comments. So the dynamic right now is a little different because I mentioned earlier, for the first time in 17, 18 years, you've got proposed rules that are built on statutory changes. So to that point, I mean, the first point I really should make here before I even get to that is, please never assume that the department already knows or understands the issue that you would raise. I have a great example of this. I mean, a few years ago, the department had this idea of saying, well, we're going to make all distance education students at institutions, we're going to attach them all to the main campus. So for our purpose, we'll consider all students that are in distance education programming to be at the main campus of an institution, not at one of its additional locations. And we had a client who has a distance education program that emanates from an additional location in a different state. And most of the students are in that state. And they said, well, if the department does this, we're very concerned that they'll lose access to in-state grant funding, because they'll now be deemed students of an out-of-state institution. And so the client gave us that information. We wrote comments, and the department retracted that proposal and specifically cited that comment. And I don't think that the folks over, it's just people who put their pants on one leg at a time, right? 20 or 30 of them sitting in a room trying to come up with what the policy they think makes sense. And they're supported by think tanks and others, but still, they're all just people. And they don't have your perspective as someone who may be sitting at an institution, or you may be someone in finance who supports institutions, or lawyers, or, you know, accountants. Our community and the people at institutions see things sometimes that the department does not. And that's not a deficiency on the part of the department. They're just not omnipotent. So please don't assume that the department has already thought about your issue and dismissed it, right? If you see something, it's a great opportunity for comment. And that is exactly the kind of constructive, important comment that the public needs to make. Now, it's also important to express support when the department is doing things that you make sense or you think make sense. We have a tendency, I think all of us, myself included, to highlight issues. But if you are supportive of concepts, please express that, because the risk you run is that the department will receive 1,000 comments critical of an idea and no comments in support of that idea, right? Also, and this was the point I started with, and I wanted to circle back to, is because for the first time, many of these proposed rules are based on statutory concepts. It's worth being aware of those elements of the regulatory proposal that are really just echoing or closely reflecting the statutory language. I mean, you can be critical of those. Certainly you're right. But just understand, if Congress has said, from now on, the answer to this question is A, and then the department said, okay, and the regulations, the answer to the question is A. If you write the department and say A should never be the answer to that question, you know, you can make that public comment, but the department is not empowered to change that. It's in the statute, right? So it's worth having some understanding of what's in the statute and what's in the regulation, just so that you're spending your time advocating for changes that can actually be considered and potentially implemented by the department. Also, I mentioned this earlier, but just to keep folks, encouraged and empowered, your comments can make a difference. Even when a committee reaches consensus, the department can change the final rule based on comments received during the public comment period. And finally, and I know this is easy for me to say, but stay informed to the best you can. It's just so hard right now, but at least identifying trusted resources, looking for the announcements they make on their websites and the web pages, signing up for services that send you information to your desk. All of those types of things are important right now because there's so much happening. And some of you are going to have insight, valuable, critical insight to some of these proposals, and would hate not to have the benefit of that insight on the public record because you didn't know that something was happening. And of course, in addition to all of those, I'll pause here. By the way, our third secret word is shovel, to go along with snow and winter. Our third secret word is shovel. If you choose an axe or a hammer to try to manage your snow removal, you're going to be disappointed. Don't do that. Instead, choose item C, shovel, because I think that's the way to go. And while folks are doing that, I'll just go ahead and say what I'm going to show you here next, and then I'll take Q&A. But just a reminder, we have all of our resources available on our platform, Regucation, and that includes this webinar and all the other webinars we do for free. It includes our white papers and compliance resources that we put out. Everything there is free. And the one thing I'll just highlight again, because I think it's such a great product, every month our litigation group puts together an updated summary of all the key sort of higher ed, or a great deal of the key higher ed litigation that's out there. They tell you what's going on, the status, and try to offer some thoughts about what that means for institutions of higher education. That also is free, and it also can be accessed on that website. So I'm going to take a sip of tea and give folks just another second or two, and then we'll start digging into questions. All right. And here is the webpage. Okay, so let's look at questions. I'm going to skip back to the beginning. With the diminished Department of Ed offices, how will the new regulations moving out of RISE be implemented? Boy, isn't that the million-dollar question. I mean, I think it's actually fair to ask how any of these things will be implemented. Because you've got the whole accountability framework, you've got all this new data coming into the department. I mean, I think it's going to be a tremendous challenge. And then, of course, you have the backlog that was waiting even when, before the administration initiated the RIF. So I don't have an answer for that. I think the department is under tremendous pressure to advance those regulations, especially where the concepts are rooted in OB3, because Congress has actually passed new legislation that is the law. So I think they will be motivated to try to implement the RISE and ahead changes. I mentioned earlier, I think they're working very hard to come up with simplified concepts that they think they can operationalize with fewer staff. I think they're going to continue to try to, through some of these other rulemakings, sort of diminish processes, simplify processes that already exist to free up more hands on deck. And I think they're going to hire people. I mean, I mentioned, we're hearing that they are strategically, if that's the right word, tactically going about potentially hiring people to dedicate to specific tasks to try to get through some of these backlogs. But then they're still under the standing, order to diminish themselves to the maximum extent possible. So there's definitely a tension there. And I think there really will be a question as to how successful they can be on a go-forward basis. I think it's a great question, and I just don't know the answer to it. I think it's something we'll all be waiting to see. We state on the rise and ahead slides that we anticipate a July 1, 27 effective date, but I thought the OB3 provision stated that they take effect July 1, 26. Great question, and I'm glad you asked it. So let's talk about the master calendar and these ideas around effective dates. So it is 100% true that Congress is not subject to the master calendar, right? So to the extent that OB3, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, says these things are true on July 1st, 2026, they are true on July 1st, 2026. Now, Congress can say the department will start awarding workforce, eligible workforce grants on July 1st, 2026. But if there are no certified eligible workforce programs, then there would be no grants to issue, right? So there's certain operational precedents that have things that have to be true before they can even start doing that. But let me just use accountability as a great example. The department has talked about trying to implement accountability right away, right? And they said, the accountability stuff becomes effective July 1, 26. But if you actually read the statutory language, what it says is the only thing that has to be true under the statute as of July 1, 2026 is that institutions have to begin certifying as part of their PPA that they are not offering any low earning outcomes programs. Well, if the department has not yet run the numbers or calculated anything on your programs, you can make that certification. In fact, in order for a program to even be deemed a low earning outcome program, it has to fail the metric twice. So there's no way that as of July 1, 26, any program will be a low earnings outcome program. What that means is if the department puts out an addendum to your PPA and you're required to certify you're not offering any low outcomes programs, I think you could do that on July 1, 26 without any of these regulations related to carrying out and implementing this framework actually haven't taken effect. Now, the department, we talked about this a little bit at the table, and I didn't want to get into it because it wasn't really directly germane to what we were doing. We were trying to create the regulatory package, and the timing and implementation is a little bit apart from all that. But we did talk about it briefly, and the department seemed to acknowledge that there's some element that takes effect on July 1st, 26 by virtue of the statute alone, and then there's some element that doesn't take effect on July 1, 26 that will is part of this regulatory framework or need not be carried out or in effect on that day, right? And that would be subject to the master calendar requirement. And for those who forget, the master calendar says if you're creating Title IV regulations, they have to be in the Federal Register as final rules by November 1st to take effect by the following July 1. That's one way I was talking in terms of July 1s. So my expectation is what we're probably going to see, and the department sort of laid this out during ahead, is that on July 1st, 26, institutions have to be ready to make that certification. I think you may be asked, there could be a PPA addendum or something like that you would have to certify. And then you're going to have to start providing data to the department. You're already required to provide data under the existing financial value transparency and gainful employment rules. So you'll be supplying your data. The department will try in spring of 27, for example, to start getting some of those numbers out. And then when the rule actually takes effect on July 1, which would be the first day of the award year, the numbers they projected for your programs become official numbers for the 27-28 award year. And the idea there is that a lot of those regulations don't actually become effective until July 1, 27. The other trick of the trade is the department can designate something as an interim final rule, and it doesn't bind institutions, but the department can volunteer to comply with that interim final rule. So to the extent the department puts out a final rule or an interim final rule about accountability, it can say, well, we're going to voluntarily go ahead and comply with all this stuff and start crunching the numbers. And they can say, and institutions can voluntarily comply. And you might say, well, why would we want to do that? Well, what if the reporting requirements are lesser than the current requirements under financial value transparency and gainful employment. You could choose to comply with those lesser reporting requirements. So all this is to say, it's a great question. It is true that there are elements of the statute under, loan limits and Pilgrim, all those different things that are effective by the statutory language as of July 126. To the extent the department is creating regulations that are absolutely necessary and tied to those things that have to be effective on July 126, I think there's an argument that they are effective notwithstanding the master calendar. To the extent that there are regulatory concepts or parts of the regulatory packages that don't have to be effective July 126 for the statutory language to be carried out, I think there is a question as to whether those really can become effective outside of the master calendar. And I think as a practical matter, what we're probably going to see is the department just sort of introducing these concepts through interim final rules and policy to the best of it can until the date that these regulations become effective. I know that was a complicated and nuanced answer, but it's a great question. And it's one that a lot of the lawyers and policymakers in the space I know have been thoughtful about. All right. We are a 1 to 2 year technical college. Many of our students are less than full time. Is there any direction on how we go about doing loan proration? Yeah, another great question. So shortly after OB3 came out, I think it was in August or September, the department put out a Dear Colleague letter / electronic announcement. I can't remember if it was one or both. But it basically said, look, there are certain things that became effective immediately, like on July 4th of 2025, like when the legislation took effect, a handful. And they said, these are the handful of things, and this is how we're handling those. And one of them was loan proration. And what's interesting is the statute actually says that you have to prorate loans in accordance with the schedule delivered by the secretary. And the department in that electronic announcement from August, September, I can't remember exactly when it came out, late summer, early fall, it said, wait until you get the schedule from the secretary. I mean, first of all, you as institutions, I think, have cover and can feel comfortable because the statute actually says that you're supposed to do it in accordance with the schedule delivered by the secretary. But then the department affirmed that in its guidance and basically said, yeah, but, look, we're working on the schedule, sit tight, and we'll get it to you. So that's the answer. And that's for everybody, not just a 1 or 2 year technical. Any school, you're going to have loan proration you're going to have to engage in, and you should wait until you see that schedule from the department, which I assume will also include a little bit of guidance around how you should implement that. Okay. Let's see. Oh, was VA benefits discussed as grants? Yes. The negotiation. So I think what this question is asking is around the new limitation when you're talking about non-federal aid, right? And this question of I'm sorry, I had to close my eyes to think about it. Does this question of non-federal aid exceed the total cost of attendance such that somebody would not be eligible for a Pell Grant? Are VA benefits included or excluded in that conversation around non-federal aid? Yes, actually in the draft, the gentleman, Matt, who was the negotiator for veterans, who was a sterling gentleman and did a great job as a negotiator. And I appreciated the time I got to know him actually very much. Did a great job representing his constituency, brought this point up precisely. And there is language in the draft regulatory text that specifically talks about how certain veterans and other benefits are excluded from that calculation. So great question. Thank you for asking that. Let's see. In terms of the AIM committee, will they address issues with saying that we must not reference race, ethnicity, or sex, while also now requiring us to submit student level admissions and completions data by race, ethnicity, and sex? Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, by the way, this tension has sort of always existed, right? Like it's already, you can't require students to provide certain types of information. You can offer them the opportunity to provide it voluntarily. On the other hand, if you want to establish yourself as an eligible, HSI or MSI, et cetera, for certain programs, like you actually have to demonstrate that a percentage of your programs or a percentage of your student body satisfies certain minority or Hispanic serving thresholds. So there's always sort of this tension about like, well, how can we show that if we at the same time can't require people to provide us with that data? I think that sort of tension has been out there for a long time, but I agree that it has sort of come to a head here It's interesting. I don't know if that will come up as part of the rulemaking, but it's certainly something, if it doesn't, that folks could ask, like for clarity. I'll tell you another similar situation. When I was a rulemaker in 2017, one of the things we talked about was false certification discharge. And we talked about this idea that, a student is eligible for a false certification discharge if you package them for financial aid with the not, and it turns out, I don't even know it's with the knowledge, but if it turns out that they are not physically capable, or there's something that would impede them, like a disability that would impede them from being able to actually work in the field that they're being prepared for. And so you say, well, wait a minute, I can be deemed for a false certification discharge if I approve someone for financial aid and it turns out they have a disability that would disqualify them from becoming a licensed professional in the field. But I'm also not permitted during the admissions process to ask someone about whether or not they have a disability. And so we asked the department, and I mean, we actually filed this comment on behalf of an institution. So, well, how are we supposed to manage this? And the department said in their response, well, you can't ask them anything pre-admission. Now, there may be other ways that you can elicit that information by showing them the technical requirements to be successful in the program, et cetera. But you can't directly ask them if they have a disability pre-admission. But post-admission, as part of the financial aid process, and prior to actually packaging for financial aid, you can, because it's not a basis for your admissions decision. And in fact, if you don't ask them, and again, it turns out that they have a disability that would prevent them from obtaining professional licensure under state laws, you could actually be dinged for a false certification discharge. So sometimes there are these sort of nuanced issues where concepts seem at tension. And one way to try to get at that is to ask the department, and as part of public comment, to please address the issue on the record. And the department has had some willingness to do that. In fact, there were, during the rulemakings, the rise and ahead rulemakings, there were a lot of points where we asked the department, would you commit? We're not asking you to change the regulatory text, but would you commit to addressing this issue with specificity and commentary to the proposed and final rule, or proposed or final rule? And the department had a running list. They said, yes, we will commit to that. So it's absolutely a great question to ask. Will the expanded reporting obligations require schools to report any previously established degree programs, or will this only be new programs on a go-forward basis? Yeah, great question. When I first read the draft regulatory text, I took it to mean like you'd have to go back in time, but the department, their position seemed to be pretty clearly, at least in our conversations. And I went back and sort of looked at the draft text, and I thought, well, I guess this is what it says. I took it to mean just on a go-forward basis to establish the eligibility of new programs for direct loan. But I think that's another thing. Let's take a hard look at the proposed. So that, my understanding is that's what the draft text meant. And that was my understanding of the representations the department made at the table. But I think that that is absolutely something that folks should go back and take a hard look at when the proposed rule comes out. And if it's not, I tell you what, if it looks like in the proposed rule that the department is actually suggesting that you'd have to go back in time, I mean, that's where you go pull the meeting minutes from the record where this conversation was had. By the way, that is possible now. NEGREG is now transcribed, so you could go back and look at the record and all the comments that were made. I had someone who was doing that for a project we were doing for a client just recently. So, one of the things you can do when you're preparing your public comment is if you feel like the department during NEGREG said something that was different from what shows up in the proposed rule, go pull the meeting comments and say, this is not what was discussed, as the basis for consensus. Just something to be thoughtful about. Let's see. Do you think state authorization regs will be included in the kitchen sink negotiated rulemaking? Yeah, I think the department will be thoughtful about disclosures around professional licensure programs and maybe trying to tighten up or clean up some of that framework. I think they've received a lot of feedback from institutions, and there's still some confusion maybe about exactly what's supposed to be done. I don't know about the department's willingness to go back to like the fundamental concepts about like the definition of, sort of a state reciprocity agreement and that kind of thing. I'm not saying they won't. I just have candidly, I've not heard a lot of conversation around that, but you know who always knows the answer to those questions? She may be on the line, but Cheryl Dowd and the folks over at SAN, which is part of WCET, tend to follow that more closely than anybody I know. So they would probably know better than I would. But as of right now, I've not sensed that is a primary for this administration, just a hot topic that they're trying to get into, right? What should institutions applying for initial authorization for Title IV expect in the new understaffed department? Slower, simpler, more customer friendly, quiet for 2 years? Yeah, great question. Actually, we've just been looking into that for someone. And I think certainly I would expect slower. There just aren't as many hands on deck. I would expect a customer friendly experience. The problem isn't willingness or it's not the willingness of folks to pick up the phone or to be friendly when they're interacting with you. The problem is the ability of folks to actually get e-apps completed, to get them cleared in the system, and then for those approvals to get migrated into other relevant systems. That's the problem. It's not a lack of will. It is a lack of hands on deck and technical and system issues. Right. So I'm not suggesting it can't be done. But, I would not expect like a 3-month process. I mean, I would expect like a 6-month process, and that's assuming everything you've got is in order. And that's probably a best case scenario. I would love to be proven wrong. But and like I said, we've been thoughtful about this very question recently. I don't think everyone's going to disappear completely. And this could be one of those things where they hire a few people to just do this in high volume, like new applications for Title IV. So maybe that'll have an impact as well. Let's see. Specific to the AIM NEGREG, do you think there is a statutory basis for the department to go as far as requiring accreditors to have a standard requiring institutions to hire faculty with a wide variety of beliefs? Where is the statutory line on the department dictating specific accreditation standards beyond the general topics currently outlined in the HEA? Boy, this is a great question, and I'm just going to apologize. This is a really complex and nuanced question. I think it's an important one, and one that's going to come up in the future and be commented on in public comment. I think it is also one that may arise at some point in litigation. But I mean, there are a lot of different statutory authorities and limitations in play here in terms of sort of the federal government's ability to decide upon what grounds it's going to recognize accreditors. I mean, I think it has a lot of authority to do that. There are also limitations, that are placed on the federal government, some of them constitutional. I think that's a very complicated legal answer. And so I apologize for punting on it, but I don't even think I could begin to wade into it. That having been said, I think it is going to be a question that folks are wading into in the near future. Let's see. Looking for clarification. I thought you said the earnings premium test was going to replace financial value transparency in GE, but then you said the latter was still in effect. Can you please clarify? Yeah, this is a great question. It actually sort of going back to the prior question about statutory authority. So, the department has claimed since the first term Obama administration that it has the ability to apply some sort of metric or test to any program that is a gainful employment program. And whether a program is gainful employment or not sort of goes to in the statute and regulation how it's qualifying as an eligible program. But all programs offered by proprietary institutions and all non-degree programs offered by public and private nonprofit institutions are gainful employment programs. Meaning they qualify as eligible for Title IV in a category that, among other things, says to be an eligible program, you have to prepare people for gainful employment or recognized occupation. So the Department of Education is taking the position that it has the ability to sort of say, well, what's that mean? To successfully prepare people for gainful employment. And they said, well, this is what it means. It means that your students, after they graduate, so many years out, there's a debt to earnings rate of this, or they're above an earnings threshold of that, or insert metric. It doesn't matter. The idea is they're saying the statute says for a gainful employment program to get Title IV, it has to, among other things, satisfy this gainful employment test or standard. And we are interpreting that to require that you satisfy this metric or that metric. So Congress came along and they said, totally independent of financial value transparency and gainful employment rule, they said, we just have a new accountability framework, and we're going to have this earnings premium test, and it's going to apply to all undergraduate degree programs, graduate degree programs, and graduate certificate programs. Doesn't cover non-degree. And so they said, department, this is what you're going to do. Go forward and make regulations. And so the department said, okay, well, we got this regulatory framework that's already in the books. Some of it applies to all programs, you know, some of the calculations and disclosures. And then for gainful employment programs, and by the way, all that stuff, all the financial value transparency stuff, the requirements that institutions supply the data, they crunch the numbers and put it on the website, that's not under the gainful employment statute authority. That's really under the department's consumer information authority, right? So what the department is saying is, when it passed the financial value transparency rules, is it's saying we have the general authority to gather data and supply information to consumers. So we're going to gather all this data or crunch these numbers. But for gainful employment programs, we're going to sanction them, and they can lose Title IV eligibility because we're going to use one of those tests, or two of them, debt to earnings and earnings premium, that we're calculating for these gainful employment programs as the measure of whether they actually prepare students for gainful employment in a recognized occupation. So financial value transparency, all that stuff sort of justified under the department's consumer information statutory authority, general authority. And then the gainful employment tests and sanctions applied to gainful employment programs are justified under that statutory language saying that those types of programs, again, have to prepare students for gainful employment, right? And then you've got the do no harm statutory framework that clearly applies to, you know, graduate degrees, undergraduate degrees, and graduate certs. And so what the department has said is, this is very complicated. So what we're going to do is, Congress wants us to apply one type of test, and they want us to apply that type of test to graduate programs and undergraduate programs and graduate certs. It's an earnings premium. And by the way, in the eligible workforce Pell statutory section, there's also a concept that sort of ties to an earnings threshold. So Congress, in multiple scenarios in OB3, says, we think the right test is just an earnings threshold test. Don't even bother with the debt to earnings, it's just earnings threshold. So then the department said, okay, we think, this administration said, we still think we have the statutory authority to regulate gainful employment programs and even apply sanctions to gainful employment programs if they don't, you know, meet this gainful employment test, whatever that might be. But we're going to get rid of debt to earnings and the earnings threshold test that was in the regulation. And we're going to take the new earnings threshold test that's part of the statutory framework, and we're going to say, from now on, when we measure gainful employment programs, we're just going to use the same test. So all types of programs, every program is going to have the same sort of earnings threshold test that it has to meet. For graduate programs, undergraduate programs, and graduate certs, it's under the authority of OB3 of the Do No Harm Accountability Framework. Its application to non-degree programs is by virtue of the gainful employment statutory authority. And then all of the reporting requirements and the disclosure on the program information website continues to be under our sort of general consumer information authority. So you've got three different statutory authorizing sort of statutory schemes that lie underneath the unified accountability framework that ultimately was proposed by the department and that was considered by the AHEAD committee. Boy, that was a really long and complicated answer. But it was a great question. Okay, I got one more in me. Let's see. All right. Okay. Will the department enforce the financial responsibility triggers that were created during the Biden administration? Yeah, I think they will. For now, I think, well, okay, let me take this from a couple of different standpoints. So first of all, we're talking about under financial responsibility. You may remember that the Obama administration introduced a new framework, and it included a bunch of financial responsibility trigger concepts. So the idea was, if certain events occurred between your financial audits, you had to report those to the department. And depending, some events could result in a recalculation of your composite score or a requirement that you post a letter of credit. And the Obama version was fairly expansive. So then the Trump administration came along, the first Trump administration, and they reconvened a negotiated rulemaking committee and reconsidered bar defense and close school loan discharge and false certification discharge and those financial responsibility triggers. I know, because that was my NEGREC in 2017 that I was a part of. And the department didn't propose, nor did the Department of Trump administration get rid of all those financial responsibility triggers. They just slimmed them down. And they made them a little more practical for institutions. Like under the Obama model, one of the things institutions had to report was all litigation. And I know we did a blog post once that got more clicks than I think any blog post we've ever done. And we were getting calls from schools all over the country saying, wait a minute, what are you talking about? We have to report all our litigation to the department. And I think a lot of folks realized that that was not practical the way a lot of that was phrased in the regulation. So the Trump administration winded it down, but they did not get rid of it. And this is the critical point I want to make here. So then the Biden administration came along and they expanded it again. And that current version of the financial responsibility reporting requirements is in the law. The department has a legal obligation to enforce those regulations. And I think they will revisit them potentially as part of the kitchen sink NEGREG, but I don't know that they are inclined to get rid of that entirely. I think this administration, just like the first Trump administration, sees value to knowing between audits if institutions have suffered significant financial setbacks. And I don't think they think it makes sense to get rid of those. So I think from a rulemaking standpoint, yes, it will probably be included. And my guess is you will see again a slimmed down version, but a version nonetheless that remains. There's sort of the separate question, though, about whether the department has the staff to actually enforce this thing. Or for that matter, how many of you, I'm not asking you to raise hands, are actually reporting these things? My guess is, I'm speculating, my guess is the vast majority of institutions in the United States are not reporting all of these triggers. Many of them probably aren't aware even that they exist or of the full scope of them. And then the Biden administration put out a bunch of guidance around them, which in my view, some of it was not consistent with the regulation that they had created, which created a lot of confusion. So, I think the first question is, are schools even reporting them, or should they be? I mean, they clearly have a legal obligation to do so, but I'm distinguishing between that and the should question. And then the other question is, if you're actually emailing these things in, is there someone at the department who's doing anything with them other than just registering that they were submitted? I think right now the folks at the department generally who manage issues relating to audits and financial responsibility, I think that group of people is very small. It's one of the bigger issues I think the department has right now. And so my sense is that there probably is not someone looking at every one of these, even to the extent they are being reported. But as a legal matter, certainly the department continues to have an obligation to at least be registering them, if not acting on them. So another sort of complicated question when you think about all the different dynamics in play. But I don't think that financial responsibility framework is just ever going to go away entirely. It hasn't since it was introduced. And again, I think one administration to the next, they do see a lot of value in it. The question is just going to be if they ever come up with something that's actually operational for the department and enforceable for the department, and that schools begin to really actively participate in, because there are consequences for noncompliance. All right. Thank you all, as always, for tuning in. I'm so grateful. I hope, I mentioned earlier, truly, that everyone is safe and your electricity is back on and that you are digging out successfully. And I'll just say, as always, we appreciate you so much. Please fill out the survey. And until next time, be well.